Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back, one and all, to this episode of A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. The voice that you are hearing right now is that of one Evan Buck, and joining with me are two other distinguished gentlemen of nerdological historian pedigree, in no particular order. Dylan, how about you say hi to our audience?
Hello, everyone.
And Chris, how about you say hi to the good people?
Hi, good people.
Man, you left us hanging there for a
Just
while.
had to leave us hanging.
You had to leave us hanging, but now that it's officially an episode, we can get things kicked off and get things underway. So, in today's episode, we're going to be taking a look at a particularly fraught and interesting point of history in a little Western European country known as Spain. And this little country seems to like to have a lot of civil wars and uprisings and conflicts. And so this episode's going to focus on the Spanish Civil War. Now, I left a little pregnant pause there for a reason, because there are plenty of such civil wars in Spain's history. So you might ask yourself, which one are we going to be discussing today? Well, the one that we're actually going to be discussing is not just one, but I guess depending on how you look at it, it can be 3 or 4 separate coups, uprisings, civil wars, whatever you want to call them, that all happen in a rather compact season of time in the 1930s. But in 1936, that's when we get, I guess, what you can call the formal Spanish Civil War. So with enough provocation on my part, let's jump into a little bit of the background of what we're going to be looking at here. So, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Don't worry. So, I want to start with the overthrow of the monarchy in 1931. In 1931, the Spanish monarchy walks away from it. And leading up to this, they've had a couple of other military takeovers, but these are more like the military cooperating with the monarchy and running things. And at this point, the military is discredited because they haven't run it well. The monarchy steps aside, and there's an established republic in Spain, an elected government. I believe this is the second Spanish Republic because, like Evan said, there's a lot of turnover here, but this is the second Spanish Republic. And to kind of, I think there's a really, really good show. It is subtitled, I will warn you, Cable Girls, that talks about the phone operators at the Madrid telephone company around this time. And the reason I really like that is because it picks up on so many of the changes going on. And it really helps illuminate the two sides here, because the Republic is modern, is Western, is urban. It is largely supported by intellectuals, by the educated classes, lawyers. It is also supported by urban workers. Even though Spain may be a little bit of a backward country, it's still a European country. After 1920, there is a large union, socialist, communist presence, and that becomes very important later on. There's also within Spain 2 regions that are in Spain, but don't try and tell them that, of Catalonia and the Basque country up north. Both of those groups become pro-republic because the republic kind of allows regional autonomy rather than looking at kind of a Ferdinand and Isabella unitary monarchical state, kind of a top-down situation. So that's the groups within Spain that are pro-republic.
And keep in mind, we also have somewhat of an oxymoron here, anarchist parties. That's right. You hear it right. If you already thought that Spanish politics was weird enough as is, we have anarchist political parties and the first anarchist unions, I believe, as parties of this coalition as well. So, this expression politics makes strange bedfellows. I think this is perhaps one of the greatest examples of that.
It's amazing. And I love it. And yeah, another shout out, Homage to Catalonia. Really great Orwell book, explains like a lot of those really weird things going on. However, on the other side of the people that maybe don't necessarily kind of wish the monarchy would have stuck around because things were pretty good for them back in the good old days, these would be the Spanish Catholic Church, the landowning groups, and the military. One of the things that the Republic did is it fired a lot of generals because Spain was one of the most top-heavy militaries there were, because so many people, their grandfather was a general, they were a general, their father was a general, and these are mass, these are like, it doesn't make sense for the size of the Spanish military. The Spanish officer class was built up and was about the size that it needed to run like Philip II's empire, where it was almost the entire Western Hemisphere. They just never downsized them. So you had a lot of a large officer class that opposed the Republic as well. So the Republic has elections in 31 where the majority is kind of what would look like a small d Democratic majority to the West, liberals, intellectuals, doctors, lawyers, that kind of group comes into power. In 34, there's an election where what's called the National Front wins. And the National Front is these people that, some monarchists, and we're going to get a little bit into what a monarchist means, because all the monarchists aren't even on the same side. But the National Front wins in 34, and there's a lot of fear in kind of the Republican areas that this is going to lead to backsliding. This is going to lead to the monarchy coming back. And so you have in 1934 in north central Spain, which the best way to explain it to an American would be to picture Pittsburgh. It's a coal country. And it's honestly, I love in my mind seeing how coal areas become radical in the United States, in the Russian Civil War, and in Spain. All these things happen. It's very interesting. Anyway, promise I'm going to get back to a point here. The miners in Asturias mount a revolution and kind of do almost like their own October Revolution. They take over the area. They declare, this is we're in charge now, and that Spanish military comes in and crushes it and like devastates the area, kills hundreds of miners. And in the aftermath of that, it's very similar to what you have in the Russian Revolution, because right after the July days, the threat of a Bolshevik coup, you have a right-wing coup. They look at the Republic and say, hey, you guys let that happen. Maybe we need to step in. So, Dylan, do you want to talk about the monarchist coup that happens right after this?
Yeah, so the monarchists have always been kind of a thing in Spain. Obviously, for the last 100 years or so, they've been bouncing back and forth between a monarchy and a republic. But they have this last attempt at an uprising, and this, I'll be perfectly blatant, this is not my area of expertise. So if I omit something and y'all want to jump in and add flavor, feel free. There's several planned rebellions that kind of happen in this time period. There's one that kind of kicks off. All these generals have plotted all this stuff. Actually, Jose Sanjurjo did one in 1932 that he tried to kick off, and it kind of failed. But long story short, they try to rebel. and basically it falls apart. In the aftermath, Sanjurjo specifically, who is, to kind of start emerging what our episode's about, this is who our episode's really going to be about. Jose Sanjurjo ends up trying to flee to Portugal after the last of these monarchist sort of anti-republican sort of revolutions, gives himself up before he gets to Portugal, gets sentenced to death, then gets commuted to life in prison, then gets given amnesty, and then gets to Portugal anyway to live in exile. It is the dumbest loop on the journey to Portugal I've ever heard of. But anyway, Jose Sanjurjo, who had been this military figure in the republics, and since the Great War, he was kind of this figure of these monarchist sentiments. He is in exile in Portugal. Well, when the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936, this is where he is. He had actually, ironically, only like a month and a half before the Spanish Civil War breaks out in late summer of 36, he had tried to do his own purely monarchist revolution, decided against it, and then the Spanish Civil War breaks out, which is a much more broad-based conservative revolution. You've got your straight military junta style, dictators, your general conservative reactionaries, your sort of semi-fascists, nationalists, kind of the Franco kind of people.
Yeah, we got the Francoist, Francisco Franco.
Yeah, the Francoists, and some of the more expressly, Mussolini type fascists, and then these classic monarchists. And the monarchists, you have to understand, are two, there's liberal monarchists and there's conservative monarchists. Jose Sanjurjo is the archetypal sort of military figure who follows the conservative monarchist. In Spain, these are known as the Carlists. Carlists, to make a long, dramatic succession family tree story incredibly short, Carlists believe they supported one family line to the Spanish throne. That was the descendants of Don Carlos, as you might imagine. He was the brother of the last Spanish king, Ferdinand VII, who died in like 1833, without any kids, but with a pregnant wife. Some of you may recall that the kings of Spain were of the House of Bourbon, which is a French throne. Spain, historically, had a fairly even, agnatic, cognatic descent, so they didn't really prioritize necessarily super exclusively, male inheritance over female inheritance. The French historically have followed a Salic or male-dominated descent. So when the House of Bourbon took over the Spanish throne, they essentially have to sort of transplant a male preference onto a sort of relatively even preference in terms of descent, and this causes problems. In 1789, the king at the time had decided to try and reinstitute the sort of Spanish version where the daughters could inherit if there were no male sons, but they never followed it. Until 1833, when Ferdinand VII released the 1789 decree because he had no kids, his wife was pregnant, and he had a brother. Don Carlos was the brother who would have been, under the French purely male descent, the heir apparent. He was the heir presumptive. He was the infante, which is kind of like the dauphin in French monarchic terms. He's the heir presumptive. However, Ferdinand VII issues this proclamation that says, whoever my child is, whether she be female or male, is going to be my heir. That starts the Alphonsine line of the Spanish throne, who are the ones in the 1830s. Spoiler alert, Ferdinand has a daughter. She becomes queen, ousts Carlos, who starts the Carlist line. So that's where these two lines come from.
Yep. And so ultimately, bringing it back full circle to where our fork and our divergence is going to be coming into play, we have General Sanjurjo, who his father is a Carlist. He himself has Carlist tendencies. He is attempting to fly back to Spain because very loud Spanish Civil War noises are starting to happen, and he is needed to be boots on the ground and kind of help navigate the operations and be one of the brains behind what's going on for the fascist forces.
What kind of happens is basically all the military all the conservative forces get together and say, we're going to have this revolution. We're not going to worry about who we're going to put on the throne. We're going to go back to the monarchy. We'll
We just
figure
don't
out
like
which
it.
one later.
Yeah, we're going to blow it up and then figure it out later.
We'll deal with the Republicans first, and then we'll quibble about what happens after that point.
And the plan is that he will fly back from Portugal. He has been around forever. He is respected by everybody. And the idea is that he is going to land in Madrid the day of the revolution. The army barracks, the army units throughout Spain will rise up, will overthrow the local Republican government. He will land in Spain, and he will land into a triumphal parade.
Boom. And here's the thing.
Boom was a good word there.
Yeah. Because, a little bit unfortunate, but very apropos, because in our timeline, none of those dreams were able to be realized. Our general friend, Sanjurjo, he was known for being very much into pomp and circumstance. And of course, he would decide to get on a tiny plane, very much overburdened and overladen with lots of his very fancy military garb, personal sorts of belongings, things that meant a lot to him. And he was very much into the pomp and circumstance. So because it is heavily suspected that because of all of this, because of Sanjurjo's taste for sentimentality and dramatic gestures, this is what unfortunately led to the plane crashing, being brought down by a lot of the heavy luggage that he brought with him. So that is what happened in our timeline. In the fork that we are going to be looking at in today's episode, we're going to be assuming that Sanjurjo lives in one form or another, either because he ditches all the fancy military uniforms, or he ends up taking a different plane, thus living to become the leader of the Nationalist faction in Spain. So, with all of this set up, Dylan, I think a good place to go back would be to kind of parse a bit of the Carlist tendencies and the different monarchical schools that are going on here.
Yeah, and I didn't mean to get too off into the forest for the trees for the forest too early there, but yeah, I think because of who Sanjurjo is, it is important to kind of belabor that point a little bit to give us some context. And Sanjurjo and a lot of his family were Carlists. This descent from Don Infante Carlos, like I told you, he would have been the male descendant. The Carlists couldn't stand it that they got basically beat out for the throne. And during the 1800s, the Spanish monarchy gradually liberalized and would take things over. The Carlists could never stand it because the Alfonsines, they kept liberalizing, they kept losing their crown, the republics, they'd give people the vote, all this stuff. This was not a good Carlist monarchist line of thought. So Sanjurjo, when he successfully lands, represents a part of this very significant political faction with his Carlist support that in our timeline tended to kind of take the back burner. They were still very much a part of the coalition, but they, with Sanjurjo's death, and then later once Franco kind of consolidated the political and military authority into himself over the Civil War on the conservative side, they kind of took a back seat. So in this timeline, the Carlists are going to be very much more, and monarchists in general, but specifically Carlists, are going to be much more of a force that has to be dealt with and is going to be more prominent in the coalition of nationalist figures because of Sanjurjo and his historic ties with Manuel Falconde and the sort of traditional Carlist sentiment.
So basically what you had is almost like a super monarchist group. They're monarchists, but they're opposed to the current monarchy. They think that monarchy isn't monarchy enough. Is that kind of
kind of, sort
I
of,
think it's
except you have
illegitimate. I think it's an illegitimate monarchy, right? That's what
Yeah,
they're basically arguing.
basically, yeah.
Is
But at this
this
point,
other bourbon line was not legit.
Well, because the other thing is this: the updated the existing line, the line that did serve, kept having these constitutions and kept like basically
Yeah.
in the Carlist mindset, they kept caving to
Yes.
anarchy.
Yeah, they're the
Mhm.
liberal branch, whereas the Carlists are the quote unquote true, sort of more ancien regime, to use a French word and a French phrase in a Spanish setting. The sort of classic conservative, the sort of autocratic king sort of sense. Yeah. So that's important to note, and that's kind of the cause of a lot of this conservative discontent. That and these Alfonsists keep having republics declared. They can't do anything. They can't even keep the monarchy.
Yeah. And something to keep in mind as well is to further support this point is that Sanjurjo's father was actually himself a Carlist. So it definitely stands to reason that a Sanjurjo world, a world that he lives in that still leads that faction, could have taken things more in that direction. Because I'm going to say, as I did my notes and was reading over things for this alternate fork, there is for any enthusiasts of alternate history, you might have thought of this novel or set of novels because it actually starts with this same fork in time. Harry Turtledove, a very famous alternate history novelist, in his series The War That Came Early, he begins I believe it's the first novel actually in this series of books called Hitler's War, and it actually begins with Sanjurjo's flight from Portugal. So Turtledove's divergence is that Sanjurjo accepts the pilot's advice and abandons the luggage so the flight is not overloaded. And so from that point on, Sanjurjo's behavior kind of diverges from that of the Franco in our timeline. But as Chris, and you can probably elaborate on this a little bit better than I can, the main issue with the Turtle Dove interpretation and all the events that happen after that point is there really are kind of two forks in history that happen as a result of Sanjurjo living and what Turtle Dove takes in his novels. So me personally, I think without getting too much into the weeds on that, it's probably better to, as we traditionally like to do on this show, just take one fork at a time and go from there.
So yeah, he got into something with the Sudeten Germans, and we're not going to deal with that. But the interesting thing I'd say is if we have try to move it along, if we have Sanjurjo in charge of the nationalist forces, in our timeline, when it winds up being Franco, he does not bring back the monarchy.
Nope.
At least not. He brings it back in 47 with a rubber stamp, but
and he kind of he brings in almost a British style monarchy, a very stay out of my business. And I think one of the things is if we have Sanjurjo in there, he is very tied to a very specific branch of the family, and I think you see him almost staying out of politics in a way of we are going to win this war and put the Carlist on the throne, put the rightful successors on the throne.
I think there's much more of an emphasis on that.
Yeah.
And that leads to a question that I think is really the most fascinating one to me in terms of this fork in time is, we know with the Francoist regime, the monarchy wasn't brought back until it became a rubber stamp. But in those intervening years, from the 30s to the 40s, there was a little conflict that happened. Not a major one. Not one that, totally altered geopolitical landscapes or anything. World War II.
And that's what I was setting up with the African army.
Yes.
The way the African army got involved in the Spanish Civil War at all is that Franco picked up the phone and called called Italy, and had them mount a massive airlift to fly those troops from Morocco into peninsular Spain. And that kind of shifted the entire balance of all of this in favor of the Nationalist. And people that look at the Civil War kind of say this might have been when it goes on for another 3 years. But once the Army of Africa comes in, that might be the decisive point when the Nationalists are going to win. So even before we get into like World War II and everything else, the Italians and the Germans are very important, providing support to the Nationalists. And it's really interesting to look at this. If you look at this, this is still the early period of the Nazi regime. And if you look at it in terms of the involvement here, the Italians are still the big brothers in this relationship.
Yeah, and I think I think that, obviously, especially the Germans, this is where famously they did a lot of the Condor Legion stuff with a lot of early air experience and tank experience. I don't think there's any question that there would have still been some, especially Italian, maybe German might be a bit more up for debate, at least some air involvement still. I think there's still going to be some involvement from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy just because of the personalities that are involved on both sides. I think it's, Hitler is going after France at some point. He's going to want somebody across the Pyrenees who's going to be friendly. I think, and this may just be me, but correct me if I'm wrong. I think the fact that Sanjurjo has a more unifying sort of figure in terms of the organization of the Spanish rebellion, I think will help counteract any potential, probably minor changes in sort of the men and materiel that come from Italy and Germany. One of the interesting things is that Sanjurjo actually was going to lead a different, purely Carlist rebellion that they were actually planning all the way up until June of 36 to take place in July of 36, right when this whole dust up starts. That, and I think the plan for that gets us into sort of a good discussion of what would have happened with this different Spanish Civil War, because I think depending on what happens with this Spanish Civil War, that changes what happens differently in World War II.
So I'm going to be really interesting here. And I'm going to pull it. I'm going to do what you guys hate when I do, and I'm just going to derail some stuff, and I hope you don't mind.
You can't mention the Basque Pro Pyramid.
Challenge accepted. How about the Basque Pro Pyramid?
Hey, there you go.
Billy,
there you go.
You're going to go.
Yeah. There you go.
Oh, Lord.
I think Italy is a natural fit for the Carlist, for a Sanjurjo regime. I think the German aspect of it, the German alliance, is more Francoist, almost more modern, more totalitarian, which is distinctively different than the Italian regime. And I think that this may have an interesting impact because I think Franco bringing in Germany and Italy to support him papered over some legitimate differences between Germany and Italy, especially over the fate of Austria. In 34, around this time, you did have Austrian fascists come to power, but that doesn't mean they're going to support the Anschluss, the joining of Austria to Germany. They openly opposed it. Still fascist, but they didn't want to join the Nazi Reich. And if you look at one of the effects of this, of the Spanish Civil War, of the cooperation between Germany and Italy in supporting the Francoist regime, This brings them together in a way and makes Mussolini okay with sacrificing the Austro-fascist. If you have a Sanjurjo regime that opens its doors to the Italian fascist, but keeps the Germans at arm's length, I think it's possible this war may extend, but I'm not sure that the Italians and the Germans may not wind up working together, may not wind up, or it may not happen the way it does in our timeline.
Yeah,
That is interesting.
yeah, and I do have some interesting thoughts there, but I want to pose a tactical rather than strategic counterpoint to that.
Yeah, because I just blew some stuff up, but
no, and I think at least in the short term for the Spanish Civil War, I think there, because of the sort of unity of the Spanish, kind of generals in uprising, I think that is going to keep the fascists at least mostly in the fold, from a foreign perspective. But if you have the Carlists on side, they're predominantly strengthened in sort of Old Castile and sort of that sort of northern band, where if you know medieval Spanish history, the sort of three kingdoms that preceded Spain really started. The original plan was for them to just go at Madrid from three sides, because if you read the Spanish Civil War, it kind of starts spreading out all over the whole country because they can't take Madrid. They try 2 or 3 times and they can never take Madrid. And every time they bounce somewhere else to try and go, okay, well, we'll take this territory. We can come back to Madrid later.
I mean, if you look at the map of Spain, you can literally see the nationalist controlled area, basically like almost not encircling Madrid, but basically it's like there's just like this kind of red wall.
Yeah, it's a northern and eastern western hook.
It's a northern western hook, and then it kind of goes just a little bit down. There's a piece of territory that they have in the south of the country as well.
And that is specifically because of that Army of Africa that moved over to the Seville area and was able to come up.
And was able to come up,
4 columns marching on Madrid. And very famously, Franco said, "We'll be supported when we get close enough by a 5th column." For those of you that have ever heard that term, that's where it comes from. The 5th column being the secret nationalist supporters they thought that were in Madrid that would help them rise up.
Yeah. And I think what would happen is, if you combine at least some German and Italian support, because I mean, any kind of German and Italian support is going to outclass most of what the Republicans have, even stuff from the Soviet Union. So if you combine a sort of stronger Carlist Northern Front and say that, Franco at least still gets some people to come support him, I think the idea of this, the sort of nationalist bloc taking Madrid in 38, that's still 2 years of fighting. But I think them taking Madrid in 38 is not out of the possibility.
I think it would be possible in May 37.
Yeah.
Historically, just to kind of update people or kind of bring in something really interesting if you ever really want to dig into this kind of stuff. In May of 37, there is open fighting between, I mentioned some of those anarchists, and the Republican government, who's a weird combination of like people we would consider being middle class liberal Democrats and communist.
Mm-hmm.
And that government kind of crushed the radical socialist anarchist in Barcelona. And I think, one, the importance of those groups in defending Madrid in 36, mixed with the need to move troops away from the front to go literally shoot at George Orwell, by the way, in Barcelona, if you've ever read that book. If the nationalists take advantage of that as a unified group, they might be able to end the war or take Madrid. And if they take Madrid, it ends quickly.
Yes, I think,
I agree.
at the very least, the Republicans probably move towards the Mediterranean. There's probably still some holdouts in, that sort of strip between, Valencia and Murcia. But it's basically once Madrid is taken in, mid 37 to early 38, the writing's on the wall. It's just a question of how long it takes them to push them out into the sea. Mm-hmm. So I guess, do we think maybe, not to kind of fast forward to the end of the Spanish Civil War here, but like, end of 38-ish, or even mid 38, the Spanish Civil War kind of being done, other than just mop-up duty?
Yeah. By the way, mop-up duty continues into the 1940s.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
In our timeline,
we got Francoist regime putting the White Terror and everything, mopping things up. Like, yeah, this is something that happened from 36 to into the 40s. They were very internally focused on dispensing with dissenters of pretty much any kind. So,
and I think some of that probably is because of the political situation in the Civil War. One, with Franco having to basically keep all of these, either eliminate or keep together all of these sort of more militaristic monarchist factions in sort of his coalition. And, because Spain at this point is completely devastated, he's got to make sure nobody can resist him, because the last thing he needs while he's trying to rebuild is to keep having to fight. So where I'm really going with this is, if you have a Spain that can end the infighting and begin the rebuilding, even a year or two earlier, that makes the subsequent what happens in World War II much more interesting, because this is a Spain that has, one less thing off its plate earlier when some of our more familiar fireworks start kicking.
And there's
100%.
There's two ways to look at this. And I think I know where you're going, Dylan. The first way is, if Spain is stronger, is more united, and is not still literally mopping up the Civil War, because the final fall of the Republic doesn't happen until March of 39 in our timeline. The first idea is that, hey, Spain is actually a country more put together, and kind of like Italy in June of 41 sees France falling. My God, let's jump in and grab something. You're probably thinking Gibraltar.
Yep, that's what I'm thinking.
And other things, but the other side of it is, if you didn't have to fight a long and drawn out war, are you then that indebted to Nazi Germany? I'm going to get back to kind of what I was suggesting is, hey, remember, Anschluss didn't happen until 38. If they are not, if you don't have a drawn out experience of Germans and Italians cooperating against the Republic, maybe you don't have the Rome-Berlin axis developed the way it did. Maybe you even see something along the lines of a stressor front.
Yeah,
that is fascinating.
Yeah, my personal inclination, more because of sort of where Sanjurjo is coming from, is I actually think, at least at the outset, there would be less involvement with Spain in the war. I think you're gonna see some sort of monarchist coalition with the fascists and the phalangists brought in, almost like a governing council of fascism without the unified party system. Like there's going to be a king, and then Sanjurjo is going to be the one who's cobbling together this council of generals and Falconde and some of the others to run the state. But because that's going to be fractured,
I think looking at Spanish like generals and aristocracy, they look at the Nazis as upstarts.
Mm-hmm, exactly.
They look at them as lower class and beneath them.
Well, and I think there's going to be some of that with the Italians too. But with the Italians, there's at least going to be more of a cultural sort of, conglomerate that they're more familiar with.
Italy has a monarchy and has signed the Concordat and is a Catholic power. And if you look at Mussolini's mindset, what does he want to? What does Mussolini want to do? Rebuild the Roman Empire.
Yep.
Look at the map of the Roman Empire.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
And to circle back to your little pet nation in this whole discussion, the Austrians.
Yeah.
Historically, the Germans tended to be very Protestant until you start getting until the south of Germany, very close to Austria, because the Habsburgs, who you may remember, helmed a little empire that was based in Vienna. They were very Catholic for a long time. They led the Counter-Reformation. So the Austrian fascists are going to be much more familiar with a sort of more Italian fascism and a more Catholic fascism than sort of the Northern Protestant, full society weirdos in Berlin.
Yeah.
So I guess the real question then is, say, okay, you've got 38, 39 cent, even maybe into 40 cent. Sanjurjo's more of a sort of neutral. They probably still do have some pretty good trade with Italy, especially because you've got sort of Morocco and Tunisia very close to Italian Libya. There's enough places where that connection seems pretty reasonable.
And just as a note for geography, what is between Morocco and Tunisia? We have a little place called Algeria, which, if my recollection is correct, Algeria was French.
Yep.
During this point in time, right? So from the little bit of poking around that I've been doing here while you guys have been discussing, I've been trying to kind of get a handle on what would the German reaction be to all of this. And from looking at what we can see in our timeline, basically the main reason why Hitler aided Franco and the Spaniards was because he was very worried about a Soviet-style socialist takeover. He did not want that. He wanted a friendly government, and he wanted ideally, the fascist conservative government that the Spaniards were, cobbling together and leading. He was pretty impressed by what they were doing. And so once Sanjurjo passed away, Hitler was kind of troubled because he's like, well, great. Now the rebels don't really have a designated leader anymore that are going to be, leading the campaign, bearing responsibility for it. And so Hitler's aide, actually, Bernhard, he was really trying to sell him hard on Franco. Franco being this, this great guy who was really impressive. He had, a strong performance in the Rif War. He was, the youngest general in the army, very popular amongst the Moroccan troops and amongst the people. So because of all of that, Hitler basically was like, okay, I'm cool with supporting, and really trying to shore up support for the Francoists. So in this timeline, I think it would stand to reason that Sanjurjo, being a more steady as she goes, establishment, older and wiser general, the situation would have been a lot more stable because we're having the Civil War ending sooner. So there therefore would not have been really as much of a reason for the Germans, in my view, to be involved, if I'm understanding this correctly.
And I think one of the other things is, as the war goes on, the Germans become more and more important because Germany is rearming. If we finish the war at this point, the Germans don't have enough to actually be playing in Spain.
Right, exactly. So moving that in the timeline earlier, because when I was doing the initial research for this, I'm like, hey, there might have been more of a sense of, indebtedness to the Germans. But if we're talking about ending the war earlier, and given Sanjurjo is more of a internally focused, he has his own agenda. He's got these Carlist sympathizing leanings. So if he's the Caudillo, if he's the head honcho, he's probably much more focused with things like getting his pet favorite monarchs back on the throne, perhaps, and taking Gibraltar, not really necessarily needing or even desiring or wanting any involvement or any significant involvement with the Germans. Which is interesting to me because this totally diverges from the Turtledovian interpretation. And as we've already noted, the Turtledovian novels have Spain ally with the Germans, mainly because, as we talked about this off podcast, the two forks that happened, and the second major fork is more important to that novel taking place than Sanjurjo actually living. So I think I agree with you guys in the end that a Sanjurjo-led Spain would have been closer to Italy, less involved with Germany, and so ultimately in the end, probably still would have remained neutral, not getting involved in the Second World War.
I mean, the thing I'm thinking about is, first and foremost, if there's no Anschluss in I believe it was March of 38, what happens with the Sudetenland? What happens with the Munich Conference? What happens with Danzig?
Well, I think there's something to remember here, and this may be a counter craziness point to Chris's craziness point of the Anschluss. For as much friendliness as we're putting between the Italians and the Austrians in terms of their Catholic background, their fascist ideology, the Italians and the Austrians have historically hated each other, mostly because of this strip of the Alps that Austria has historically had most of the control over. Look at the whole thing with Fiume that led to the sort of the beginnings of Italian fascism. Fiume is this little enclave that the Italians managed to keep after they lost it to the Austrians, who then lost it to the hot mess that is the Balkans. So I almost wonder if instead of an Anschluss, as we understand it, it's going to be almost a partition of Poland kind of deal, but between the between the Germans and the Italians, where Benito is perfectly happy to sacrifice the Austrians to Hitler if Hitler radios it ahead of time and Benito gets a piece of the pie.
What does Benito want?
That sort of northern strip.
He's already got it. The Italians took South Tyrol after World War One.
But he'll still want some of the
I agree with you.
The South Austrian border. At least there's going to be some hostility.
I agree with you that Austria is useful to Italy as a buffer state.
Yeah, Mussolini wanted an independent Austria because he was afraid that Germany was going to try and meddle and take back territory that the Italians had. So, yeah, I kind of have trouble seeing. I get what you're trying to say, Dylan, but yeah, I think you're going a little bit too far back there.
Now, the other, I mean, by the way, I don't necessarily think any of this affects Sudetenland. The Sudetens are still Germans, and honestly, looking at this from the German perspective, it is almost easier to pick on Czechoslovakia than it is Italy.
Yeah.
I don't think the Sudetenland really changes at all.
I don't think so.
There might be more pressure because that's the kind of thing Hitler could ostensibly get out of Sanjurjo is diplomatic assistance that doesn't involve economics, metamaterial, anything like that.
Right,
he can use diplomatic pressure.
Yeah, here's the thing. Franco, in our timeline, was basically wanting... So like, he recognized, okay, look, Hitler helped us out. Hitler helped us out in the Civil War. But, you scratch my back, I scratch yours, right? So Franco was pretty interested in joining the Axis only if he had his back scratched, right? Mm-hmm. So, Germany would have had to have provided food, fuel, necessities, and, basically a lot of tanks, heavy artillery, engineers, logistical ground support, because Franco also, really wanted to take Gibraltar. And Hitler, he famously said, you know what? I would rather deal with my dentist than have to talk with Francisco Franco again, because Franco was being rather exacting and demanding. So that was called off. Franco decides to stay neutral. And that is that. Spain, I will also note, was neutral during World War I, which was part of why Hitler was very invested in the outcome of the Spanish Civil War to begin with, because besides the fact that we had the Soviets and the French and the Americans all having their hands in the Spanish cookie jar at this point, which greatly worried Hitler. So,
name of our first album, by the way, The Spanish Cookie Jar.
There we go. You'd love to hear it. So if we have Sanjurjo as the caudillo or the leader or whatever, frankly, I don't think Hitler needs to worry about any of those things. Nor do I think Sanjurjo is going to be asking Hitler for a lot of things,
And
like Franco did in our timeline.
And to get more grand strategy here, who is to harken back to Napoleonic days? Who are the fascists fighting in this Spanish ulcer? Communist. And I think the running sore of the Spanish Civil War and the Soviet Union looking at this situation and seeing how France and Britain abandoned a democratic government led to the ending of the Soviet policy of united fronts. And that led the Soviet Union to sit there and look at its options and decide, similar to an Austrian situation, maybe we do want to split up the buffer state that leads to Molotov-Ribbentrop. So I think it's possible that we see, instead of Austria joining, I think maybe the Sudetenland, because people don't see Germany taking too much yet, and you still have Molotov-Ribbentrop happen the way it does in our timeline, only moved up. So now you're looking at a Soviet invasion, or now you're looking at a German invasion of Poland in 38-ish, which in the Turtle Dove series, he does the war coming early in terms of over the Sudetenland in September of 38 with the Munich crisis. But I think it's interesting to me that we still come back to this, because I think you might have a war happening, or you might have a German invasion of Poland in cooperation with the Soviet Union. The question then becomes, if you haven't had Anschluss and these other things, are the Western powers how aware are the Western powers? How prepared? How angry are the Western powers about appeasement? And how prepared are the Germans with one less year of rearmament?
So strictly of a joint invasion of Poland, I don't think that outcome changes from our timeline much in terms of the end result. I think you still have Poland partitioned. It may not take 30 days. It may take longer than that, but do Britain and France? That, I think, is the interesting one. France, I want to say, would at least be more concerned about it, both from a historical anti-German bias, but also in this time period, the French and the Czechs have almost like a big brother, little brother thing going on. So I think the British are the big wild cards in this, because this is also still kind of before they've had their big rapprochement with the French.
Well, here's the thing. The British, so let's try and figure out here, because this is something that I've mentioned a few times. We've kind of thrown around, a little bit here. The British involvement, what if, because when we have little side distractions here or there, it can actually change things quite significantly. You only have a certain amount of political capital to spend. You only have a certain amount of time that you can juggle these different things. So if we have a Sanjurjo-led Spain, first of all, I think we should parse if he in fact actually does seek to take back Gibraltar on his own now that he is able to end the war, or the Spanish Civil War earlier. Secondly, if that happens, Britain's going to be worried, obviously, about what's going on with the German and Soviet, I'll say, for lack of a better term, partitioning of Poland, ripping apart of Poland. The British are going to have their hands full. They're going to have to try and figure out, and they're also not going to be as rearmed or as prepared. They're going to try to figure out how to keep Gibraltar at this point in time. So do we assume, are we just operationally going to assume that Gibraltar is going to be a flashpoint?
No.
I think Sanjurjo doesn't want to fight over Gibraltar. I think it's a thorn in the side of Spanish national pride, but I think at least boots on the ground after the Civil War, I don't think Sanjurjo is going to be in a position where he's like, yeah, I can totally beat the Brits to take this one little piece of Spain back, the most fortified.
Right after I just beat back the Republicans and consolidated everything.
Help.
Yeah.
Without foreign assistance.
Yeah.
I would tend to agree.
Maybe, we've kind of bypassed the Anschluss of Austria, but maybe that is the pain point between, you've got a Germany who's taken the Sudetenland, taken half of Poland. The only thing they've really done out of order is deal with Austria. Maybe that's the pain point that Britain fixes on is, look, you're taking all this territory. We know you've made noises about Austria. If you take it, that's the breaking point.
And now let's
becomes
play
the red
that
line.
out. Stress a front. The British give guarantees of independence of Austria in conjunction with the Italians.
Yeah, that's where
let's play. Now let's also throw this out there, by the way. One that shifts the entire axis of the war instead of east-west to be north-south.
Yep.
Two, funny thing, Gibraltar is no longer that important.
Yeah.
Because there's no such thing as a Mediterranean
You're not
theater.
worried about access to it.
It's no longer as strategically valuable.
It's strategically valuable as the Mediterranean route to India and everything, but that's not under threat, so you're not worried about it.
It's not. Yeah, I wasn't going to say it wasn't strategically valuable, just not as much in the context of this World War.
Other interesting thing is this. So if we play this out a little bit, and we have kind of a stress front of Great Britain, France, Italy, jointly guaranteeing the independence of Austria. And let's play it out and say there is a German invasion of the Low Countries and an invasion of France. The fact that we have Spain on side here, I think Sanjurjo Spain ties to Italy. And I think it's an interesting possibility if you have the Iberian Peninsula providing strategic depth to the Western Allies.
Ooh. Ooh, this is fascinating. So, rather than in our timeline, which was essentially Franco was neutral officially, but providing a certain degree of support and minor, back scratching here and there to the Axis.
Both
we
sides.
have
He
both
returned
sides.
Allied
Played both
airmen.
sides.
Yeah, he played it down the middle.
He was playing both sides so that he could end up on top, pretty much. But here in our alternate timeline, we are basically creating a Sanjurjo Spain that is more on the Allied side of a North-South World War II, basically. It's not going to be officially, I don't think it's going to be officially an Allied country, but by and large,
it's going to lean more towards Allied neutrality.
Yeah, it would be Allied neutrality for sure. Yeah.
Well, and so not to this may be putting the end before the middle, but if you have Britain, Spain, and Italy aligned, quote unquote aligned, depending on where Spain actually lands. Does Germany still decide to go after France? And separate but related question, does Germany eventually go after the Soviet Union? Assuming the whole thing's still going by then.
So I think you've raised some really interesting things. First, I hadn't thought about this. First, I think it's possible maybe Hitler gives up Austria. He says that's too much hassle. Once you have the Nazis and the Soviets with a land border, there's no way that war doesn't happen.
Yeah, I would agree.
We're all very familiar, or when I say us, I mean the two other people I'm looking at, with the idea that Hitler's diversion into the Balkans, into Greece, Albania, and Yugoslavia in the spring of 41, many, many people say that is what cost him Moscow. He had to delay because he had to go south. Why did he go south again?
Benito got dreams of grandeur.
To pull basically the Italians' hazelnuts out of the fire.
Mm-hmm. I just saw that quote, actually. Yeah.
And if that doesn't happen, it's possible. By the way, I think maybe, Britain may look at giving up the Metaxas regime in Greece as the price of confronting Europe, of confronting the Germans in Europe. So maybe once Poland gets partitioned, if that doesn't trigger a war in the West, I would agree that Hitler probably didn't want to have to invade France. He wanted the Soviet Union. A partition of Poland sets that up for him.
It sets it up perfectly.
There's something else that happens in 1940 it kind of gets forgotten about, but is essentially, especially in a world like this where you have a Germany that's been antagonistic, but at this point, arguably not really that much more than they were in a lead up to World War One.
Rudolf Hess?
No. Just
okay.
But
okay,
good point. But this is a Germany that's antagonistic, but at least as of right now, not in a different way than has been dealt with before. They've taken arguably their own land back, quote unquote, by invading Poland. They can at least make an argument about the Czech Republic. In 1940, the Soviets arguably basically do the same thing as Hitler did in Czechoslovakia and Austria with a tiny little slice of Romania. So, this is a Western allies that are already on edge from Hitler trying to do this a couple of times. Now they've seen that there's clearly something going on with the Soviet Union too, if they're taking part of Poland. Maybe if you have at least kind of a tense piece of, an uneasy piece between Germany and the Western allies, maybe Bessarabia becomes much more of a flashpoint with the Soviets being seen as aggressors taking that, along with their sort of adventures in sort of the Baltic.
I'm going to go ahead and question two things about that and throw a third at you. Looking at King Michael of Romania and looking at who Romania had trade agreements with, in our timeline, the seizure of Bessarabia, one, was agreed to as part of the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. If that's not included, I don't know that Britain and France care about Bessarabia. I could see that the Germans care about Bessarabia, and maybe that is a spark point to protect their oil for that war. The other side of it is...
Yeah, that's more where I'm going.
The other part of it is this. Finland.
Ooh, yeah. Forgot about
Mhm.
Finland.
Oh,
Sorry,
baby.
Finnish people. Forgot about Finland.
Yep, can't forget about the Finns.
So it's possible that you have Germany, you have Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union dividing up Poland, a pox on both their houses from the perspective of the Western allies, Britain, France, and whoever else we've decided to
Shoehorned in there. Yeah.
conglomerate into this.
Whoever we throw in, yeah.
But it's even in our timeline, in the winter of 39, Britain and France, the entire Norwegian campaign in our timeline started as a attempt to push through supplies to the Finns because we viewed them as a small nation being bullied by their bigger ones. So it's a possibility in this timeline that we have not Nazi Germany being viewed as the bully attacking its neighbors and a threat to the stability of the order.
But
It's a possibility
It's
that
the
we have the
Soviets.
Soviet Union.
Right.
who
And-
have
and-
historic, from the perspective of Western Europe, been the outsiders looking in for the last 200 or 300 years, even before.
And they can very much paint to try and bring this back to where we started. I'm going to do what I can. They can paint the entire Spanish Republic, the turn it takes in the war, as communism attempting to extend its influence into Europe at the expense of the established order.
So what we're setting up is, in essence, at least potentially some alternate version of an unholy alliance, just not the unholy alliance that everyone thinks of.
And to reference the books again, as I remember, because in this series, The War That Came Early, Turtle Dove does get there with the Allies working with the Germans and then working against them. There's a couple of big switches. But we got there a different way, I think, here.
Yeah, I think so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And here's the thing. In our timeline, we have, like, independent Finland, 1917, 1919, roughly. The Soviets are kind of trying to take them back. And we have the famous Winter War, where it's like, with the Americans, we have, the trees speaking Vietnamese. And in the Soviets, they have the snow speaking Finnish, right? So we have a war where the Soviets have this communist puppet state. They try to establish this, government in exile to try and support the Red Finns, which are basically they're all just trying to cause trouble to get Finland back, right? So this happens in the interwar, what we call the interwar period, with like the late 30s, early 40s. This whole Winter War is happening. This alternate timeline shifts a lot of things earlier, and in my view, the Soviets are now very much concerned, even more concerned, with what is going on in their Finnish hills. So we're having an earlier, possibly, Winter War that's going on.
Along with a lot of other stuff.
Yeah,
Mhm.
there's whole theaters we haven't even teased yet. But
Yeah, exactly.
That I think we've set up for a part 2, possibly.
yeah,
As a possibility. Because here's the thing. If we do a part 2, this is something that I was thinking about getting into with this fork is, and so we can tease this. Whether or not we do this, we can talk about this another time. But I was fascinated because with our timeline, we have Franco taking over in the 40s, and his dictatorship lasts all the way until 1975, which, to me is a pretty crazy long time, having one man basically in charge of this whole fascist regime. He is a good 20 years younger than Sanjurjo. So in this timeline, we have an earlier end to, an earlier World War II, different World War II, possibly earlier end World War II. I don't know. That might be a little bit of a stretch to say that based on the reorientation.
We've got a very different World War II.
We have a very different World War II.
I think we have, I think Chris is right. I think, probably a second episode is good here because we can talk about not just the war and what that does, but I think you're looking at a very different post-war.
Exactly.
The geopolitical situation in the Mediterranean, no matter who wins, is going to be a completely different ballpark. And if you tie that in with a Sanjurjo who's not going to last much, if at all, into the 1950s.
He is probably passed away in the late 40s, early 50s, mid 50s at the absolute latest. Because I think, based on his age, based on other factors, he's probably, I would probably put him at like 1950, 1951-ish time frame.
And then if you then, just for the sake of our little tease we've got going here, if you, say that, Franco is the heir presumptive, that brings a whole different Spanish geopolitical calculus into the Mediterranean, whether you've still got the Italians and the Germans in the way that we understand them pre-war or some different version.
Yep.
Now this, I not to get too far ahead of ourselves before we do another episode, I actually wonder if there's only going to be one more war.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, this Second World War, from what I'm thinking about, just jumping through those, jumping through those hoops, this might not solve as definitively, or not, I won't say solve, but this won't settle, I think, as definitively the questions that our timelines World War II settled. So, anyway.
Yeah,
I think that is about as. I think we're coming back, and I think that's about as good of a point as any to finish things off. So
I see what you did there. Finish things off.
Yep. But
that's the second. That's part 2. That's the name of part 2. Yeah.
Oh yeah, 100%. But Dylan, were you able to get the name of the person who suggested this episode?
Not. I tried. I think it was. I want to say it was. I searched everything in the Discord. I tried my best. I know it was somebody. So just remember, we are listening, even if we can't remember who said something. We do hear the voices.
We do hear the voices. Hopefully, they're not inside of our head. But we do hear your voices. We are listening, and we are taking your suggestions, and love to have them be as topics. And that also gives me one last little shout out that we can put here at the end of this episode. If you have any, not just topic suggestions, but any sort of topic revisits that you would like us as a team to do, I think we just put out last week, relative to when we're recording this, we put out a little teaser that said, hey, we are thinking about going back and revisiting some old topics of ours. So if you have a new topic you want to have us discuss, or even have us revisit an old topic, some thoughts, some disagreements, or some just additional insight you have that you'd like for us to discuss, feel free to go on over to our Discord channel, which will be in the show notes. And I think with all of that wrapped up, I think there's but one thing to do, and that is to answer the age-old question of, if you see a fork in time, what should you do with it?
Take it.
Take it.
Thanks for listening, y'all. Catch you later.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/aforkintime, or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/aforkintime. We hope you will join us next time.